Imagine packing up your life and heading to a new corner of the world, hoping that the move will finally give you some breathing room. You've sorted through boxes, figured out where everything should go, and you're trying to get used to the land around you. It's a fresh start, and you're doing the best to settle in. And then strange things start happening. Not the usual moving stress, actual incidents that interrupt the day and leave you standing there, unsure of what you just saw. Sounds that a house shouldn't make. Objects shifting when no one is near them. Sudden bursts of activity that make you stop mid-task because nothing about it feels normal. There is a stretch of southwestern Ontario, near the marshes and waterways around the old Baldoon settlement. It looks peaceful at first. Open fields, long stretches of flat ground, and a landscape that seems straightforward enough. But for a family who moved there, the relocation marked the start of a series of events that pulled them into a situation that they never expected. Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path. People have always tried to make sense of strange experiences, and ghosts end up in a lot of those conversations more than pretty much anything else. Some stories paint them as helpful, like the spirits in A Christmas Carol, guiding Scrooge through his own life until he finally understands the horrible things he's been doing to the people around him. In The Sixth Sense, the ghost played by Bruce Willis helps a boy deal with the fact that he can see the dead. Plenty of people take comfort in the idea that someone they loved might still be nearby, watching over them in some way. Across different cultures, the idea of the dead communicating with the living shows up time and time again. Spiritualism grew out of that belief, with mediums claiming that they could speak to spirits and pass along messages. The idea fits neatly in with the way that most people think about the mind and the body as separate, which makes it easier to imagine that consciousness could continue after death. Hallucinations can also play a role in how these experiences are interpreted. The Society for Psychical Research collected thousands of first-hand accounts from people who said that they saw or heard someone who had recently died. More recent studies show that many older adults who lose a partner experience similar moments for a few months after the death. Sleep paralysis adds another idea, with people waking up unable to move and seeing a figure in their room. When someone already believes in supernatural encounters, these moments can feel like a confirmation. Belief shapes perception. If you're in a house with a reputation for being haunted and you catch a movement out of the corner of your eye, your brain kind of fills in the rest. In low light, when details are hard to make out, the mind leans towards whatever feels most likely based on what you already believe is possible. Ghost stories can also appear in places where people want justice. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the ghost of the king appears to his son and points to the man responsible for his death. Macbeth has Banquo's ghost confronting the person who killed him. Similar ideas appear in other countries. In Kenya, an Ngoma is said to pursue a murderer until the truth comes out. In Russia, a rusalka is described as the spirit of a drowned woman who pulls men into the water. In some stories, she is freed when her death is avenged. Poltergeists fall into another category. The word comes from German and refers to noisy spirit. Reports describe loud knockings, furniture shifting, objects flying across rooms, sheets being pulled from beds, stones thrown at people, fires suddenly, and strange electrical problems. These encounters appear in places as far apart as Brazil, Japan, Australia, the United States, and across Europe, with some of the earliest written examples dating back to the 1st century. Investigators have offered many different explanations. Some point to pranks being carried out by children or teenagers. Others focus on psychological factors like illusions or memory gaps or even wishful thinking. Researchers in anomalistic psychology have suggested that many of these events come from how people interpret ambiguous sensations. Donovan Rawcliffe wrote that most cases turn out to be trickery, and the rest could be explained by hallucinations. Even Carl Jung took an interest in the subject and believed that certain incidences in his own life came from subconscious forces acting outwardly. Freud disagreed and attributed the same events to natural causes. Of course, poltergeist stories didn't stop with the 1800s. If anything, they became a part of our cultural DNA. Movies like Poltergeist, Amityville Horror, or The Exorcist shaped the way that we picture violent supernatural activities. Knockings on the wall, furniture sliding across floors, objects flying like someone invisible is pitching them. And in a lot of these cases, the chaos seems to orbit around one person, often a child, which is why skeptics love to point out attention-seeking behavior or staged trickery. But long before Hollywood got involved, these stories were everywhere. In the 19th century, families across North America talked about stones being hurled across rooms, sudden crashes from empty spaces, and fires sparking out in corners that should never burn. Neighbors would stop by and witness something strange and then leave with their own version of stories, and these accounts popped up from everywhere, from New England to the Great Lakes. People didn't have a better word for it other than poltergeist, so that's what we called it. There are some poltergeist-like activity that even inspired entire religions. For instance, the one that happened with the Fox sisters, two young girls, Maggie and Kate Fox, living in Western New York in 1848, who claimed that they were communicating with a ghost of a murdered peddler through a series of mysterious rappings and knocks. Their stories spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered, newspapers ran with it, and without meaning to, the sisters launched the entire spiritualist movement. Seances, mediums, table tipping, the whole thing. And yes, we have covered them in a previous episode. With stories like these circulating through settlements, it didn't take much for a new region to develop its own reputation. So when a family moved into the remote part of Ontario and strange events began happening around them, people nearby already had a name for about what they were hearing. And that brings us to Baldoon. When the Earl of Selkirk toured Upper Canada in 1803 and 1804, he stopped along the north shore of Lake St. Clair and took an interest in a stretch of marshland cut through by the channel of Chanel-Écarté. The area was isolated, surrounded by waterlogged ground, and far from the established towns. Selkirk decided that this would be the site of a new Highland settlement, and he named it Baldoon, after a family estate that was recently sold in Scotland. He planned to build a large sheep farm there and began arranging for settlers to make the journey. The first group of 102 settlers crossed the Atlantic on the Aughton and reached La Chine on July 19, 1804. From there, they traveled overland to the site that Selkirk had chosen. But when they arrived, the annual malaria season was already underway, and members of the advance party were sick, including their leader, William Byrne, who died before the newcomers could settle in. The group stepped into a landscape of dense swamp, heavy brush, and ground that swallowed tools and slowed every attempt at clearing the land. Sheriff Alexander C. McDonald, acting as Selkirk's agent, spent years trying to turn the project into a functioning settlement. He invested money, labor, and time, but the land worked against him. Clearing the marshes required constant effort. Roads washed out. Grazing was poor. Sheep brought in for Selkirk's plan fell ill, and disease spread through the herds. Winters were severe, and summers brought heat and humidity that made the farm work exhausting. Supplies were difficult to obtain, and the settlers had to rely on whatever they could bring in from distant communities. McDonald also faced resistance from Upper Canada's authorities, who were not enthusiastic about Selkirk's settlement scheme. With support lacking and progress slow, Selkirk eventually shifted his attention to the Red River colony. Baldoon continued, but only with great difficulty. The War of 1812 brought another blow when General Isaac Hull's invading American forces swept through the region and destroyed Selkirk's farm. buildings were burned, livestock were lost, and the settlement's remaining stability collapsed. After the War of 1812, many settlers left Baldoon to look for better prospects, but a few of them did stay behind, and this included the McDonalds, John McDonald and his family. For many years, life on their land stayed peaceful. Nothing unusual happened, and the farm ran the way an early 19th century homestead would. But that all changed in 1829. The McDonald farmstead was a modest timber house built from local wood. It had a pitched roof, small windows, and a central hearth that kept the interior warm and served as the main gathering point. A barn sat nearby, built with heavy poles and beams that were set firmly into place. One day, several young women were in the barn weaving straw hats. They were talking and working when one of the tall wooden poles dropped from above and hit the floor behind them. They paused, looked around, and then went back to their work. A short time later, another beam fell. The men came running this time, checked the structure, examined the footing, and looked over the roof supports, but nothing appeared loose or damaged, so everyone just returned to what they had been doing. Not long after, a third pole comes crashing down. This one landed close enough to send the women running from the barn and straight into the house. No one was hurt, but the shock of 3 separate poles collapsing in a short span left everyone unsettled, to say the least. Before we continue, I do feel it's important to point out that there are some accounts that mention that John T. McDonald had recently acquired the land, and others wanted it. A group led by an elder woman had approached him several times with offers to buy it, and each time he refused. After the chaos in the barn, things inside the farmhouse took a turn of their own. The McDonalds started hearing footsteps at all hours, not the soft little creaks you can blame on an old house. Not that the house was old to begin with. These sounded heavy and organized, like a group of men marching straight through the kitchen. The family would jump out of bed, grab a lantern, and run to see who was in their home. But every time, the room was empty. Nothing moved, nothing disturbed. Then a few nights later, the marching would start again. This went on for months, and it wasn't just the family hearing it. Friends and work hands caught it too. Then came the incident with the baby. A child was asleep in a wooden cradle. Everything calm, nothing out of the ordinary. And then the cradle just snapped into motion. It started rocking so violently that 3 grown men sprinted across the room to grab it. They pushed against it with everything that they had, but the cradle kept moving like someone else was still holding it. When they finally backed away, terrified, the cradle continued to rock on its own. The most frequently reported incident involved something called lithobelia, and if you've never heard that word before, don't worry, most people haven't. It basically refers to stones being thrown by something or someone you can't see. Not tossed, not dropped, thrown. And it isn't a modern idea either, it goes way back. The term comes from a wild case out of New England in the 1600s. In 1682, a tavern in what's now Newcastle, New Hampshire, was suddenly pelted with stones. Not a few stones hitting the siding. We're talking hundreds of stones raining down on this building, and no one ever saw a single person throwing them. New Englanders took this seriously. When stones started hitting your house, you didn't just assume it was kids messing around. You assumed something supernatural was behind it. You would blame witchcraft, curses, or whatever else people could think of that would explain rocks flying through the air with no visible source. And the only way that New Englanders believed that you could fight back was by turning to the old remedies and traditions that had been passed down for generations. Some traditions believed that iron could repel spirits and witches and fey-like beings, so hanging an iron shoe horse over your door or placing iron nails in the corner of your rooms could help. Also nailing an iron spike into the threshold, or even keeping a knife under your pillow. Spirits couldn't cross iron, and that was like spiritual barbed wire, essentially. Fire and herbs were another remedy. Fire itself is seen as purifying and protective, and certain herbs like juniper or mugwort were believed to drive spirits out when burned. And the name itself, it actually traces back to an old Greek festival where people literally threw stones at each other as part of a ritual. The celebration, known as Lithobelia, was a midsummer tradition in parts of Greece and tied to older season rites meant to drive away evil, cleanse the community, and mark the shift into the hottest time of the year. Villagers would gather and toss stones in symbolic acts of protection and essentially pelt away anything harmful lingering in the air. It wasn't violent so much as it was cathartic. It was a communal reset button wrapped in ancient superstitions. And over time, the word became associated with any kind of mysterious stone throwing. The stone throwing at the Baldoon settlement started slowly enough, but eventually became extremely aggressive. Rocks and lead bullets began hitting the outside of the McDonald's house so often that broken windows became a part of the daily routine. In fact, at one point, they stopped replacing the windows altogether because it seemed so pointless. The ground around the farmhouse was constantly littered with stones and bits of lead and smooth little river rocks. One visitor said he was standing in the kitchen when a stone came straight through the window and hit him square in the chest. He picked it up, threw it back into the river, and minutes later, that same stone dropped at his feet inside of the kitchen. Family tried everything to get ahead of it. They collected the stones and bullets, marked them, and tossed them into the creek off the property. They did this over and over, and every time, the same marked pieces showed up again. Sometimes they came flying through the windows, sometimes they were just scattered around the yard like someone had emptied a bucket of ammunition into the grass. And it wasn't just the McDonald's saying this. A man named Rina Siwa talked about tying the lead balls into a small bag while 30 men watched. Within minutes, the bag was empty. He also described lead weights being pulled out of a fishing net without disturbing a single thread. Another neighbor, W.L. Burnham, was 16 at the time, and he said he personally marked the bullets, threw them into the river, and watched those same bullets come back through the window. He said that some of the stones were still wet, like they had just been pulled from the riverbed. Other witnesses told similar stories, claiming that stones came through the windows every day until every pane of glass was gone. Visitors would describe the rocks as smooth and damp, as if they had just been sitting underwater moments before being launched at the house. One man, Alex Brown, had helped gather a bunch of lead balls, mark them, tied them in a bag, and dropped them in the middle of the Chanel Écarté, 36 feet of water. Not long after, those same balls came right back through the window. There was a lot more going on than just stones being thrown at the house. Brown said he was there the day the barn burned. Alex Brown was also there when a man named Harmon was preaching in the house, and a large stone came straight through the door, broke a panel, and rolled to a stop in front of the minister. He swore that the stone looked like it had come right out of the water. Lithobelia became the most commonly reported phenomenon on the property. More than 20 witnesses talked about lead balls flying through the air, and a dozen of them described trying to figure out if someone was hiding nearby to throw them. They never found anybody. They never found a source, and the stones kept coming. It didn't stop at stones either. Brown said that he's also watched a loaf of bread slide off the table and move around the room on its own. And he made the point of saying that John T. McDonald was a respectable man and not someone who would fake any of this. In fact, many objects would fly across the room. Soap and laundry tools drifted through the air like someone invisible was carrying them. H. Dullard remembered visiting the farm as a child and watching a pot lift itself off the hearth. He also described seeing a butcher knife fly through the crowd of 50 men and bury itself inside of the wall up to the handle. There was also other paranormal happenings on the property. People also started seeing shapes forming right out of the floorboards. Victoria Hathaway talked about her brother's experience, saying he watched things rise up from the ground and take shape, sometimes like an indigenous man, sometimes like a white man, but most often as a huge black dog. And this dog wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. It showed up during some of the worst moments that happened on the farm. One witness, Darius Johnson, described seeing the dog sitting on the roof of the barn as it burned. They tried to knock it down, but the dog just barked and bared its teeth like it was warning them off. It stayed there, completely unfazed by the flames, until the fire surrounded it, and then it vanished. The animals on the farm weren't spared either. The McDonald's dog and livestock were frequently targeted. Peter Appleton said he watched a mush pot chase the family dog through a crowd of people. He swore the pot moved like someone was holding it by the handle and swinging it at the dog. The poor thing ran in circles, howling, completely terrified. Fires on the property were a frequent thing. These weren't normal house fires. They didn't start from a candle tipping over or a spark from the hearth. They just appeared. One day, more than a dozen fires broke out across the property at the exact same time. The family ran from spot to spot trying to put them out, and every time they got one under control, another flared up somewhere else. John McDonald was exhausted and overwhelmed, and the whole family felt like something was trying to force them off the land. A neighbor, William Fleury, who lived just up the road, said he watched the house catch fire in 10 different places upstairs all at once. Burnham, who had already witnessed the stone throwing, said the fires would start in several spots at the same time. And when one was put out, another one would ignite. This went on until January of 1830, when the building finally burnt to the ground. A neighbor named William Stewart lived about 3/4 of a mile away. He visited the farm during this time and said he saw many of these events with his own eyes. The strange activity at the McDonald's farm didn't stay a family or community secret for long. Word spread fast, and before anyone knew it, the Baldoon Mystery had turned into a full-blown spectacle. Newspapers started printing stories about the bizarre events happening on the property, and people ate it up. Every new report pulled in more curious seekers, neighbors, travelers, and anyone who wanted to say they'd stood on the land where all the chaos was happening. Things snowballed once the press got involved. Advertisements popped up encouraging people to visit the area if they wanted the chance to see something supernatural. Suddenly, this quiet little farming community had tourists showing up like it was the hottest attraction in the region. The McDonald farm became the place you go to if you wanted a story to tell. Now, at first, the family didn't mind the attention. They were desperate for answers, and if someone out there could help them figure out what was happening, they were willing to let people come and take a look. But after 3 years of constant disturbances and constant visitors, they were exhausted. They were dealing with stones flying through windows, fires breaking out for no reasons, objects moving on their own, and on top of it, now a parade of strangers walking through their yard, hoping to catch something on camera. Well, on whatever counted as a camera in 1820. Eventually, the family hit their limit. John McDonald decided that the only reasonable thing to do was move the family out of the house. He packed everyone up and took them to his father's homestead, which was nearby, hoping that the change of scenery would finally give them some peace. But peace never came. The activity followed them. The stones, the bullets, the fires, the noise, all of it. That's when the family realized the problem might not be the land at all. It might be them. With nowhere else to go, they eventually returned to their own property, but they refused to step foot back inside the house. Instead, they set up a tent outside and lived there, waiting for the chaos to burn itself out. They were done tempting fate inside of those walls. All the while, people kept coming. Neighbors shared stories with anyone who would listen. The newspapers continued to publish updates. The Baldoon Mystery spread across North America, and the McDonalds were stuck living inside the legend, while everyone else was watching from the outside. At a certain point, the family had to admit they were out of ideas. Whether it was one final incident that pushed them over the edge or just the exhaustion of living under constant attack, they finally decided that they needed outside help. Their first stop was the local priest. He had experience with exorcisms, so the family hoped that he might be able to calm down whatever was tormenting them. He did everything he knew how to do, but nothing changed. The activity didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to get bolder. As word of the haunting continued to spread, it soon reached a man in Michigan named Robert Baker. He was a school teacher with a big interest in witchcraft and the supernatural, and he showed up ready to clear the house. His methods didn't work either. What did happen was the local authorities arrested him for practicing witchcraft. He was convicted and spent up to a year in prison, but he also appealed to the lieutenant governor, who ended up getting him a pardon. After that, he disappeared from the record completely. The family never stopped looking for help. A Methodist preacher named Reverend McDormand tried his own exorcism, and that's when things took a darker turn. Healthy animals started dying overnight. Horses dropped in their stalls, the ox collapsed in the field while still attached to the plow. Hogs and chickens wasted away for no reason. And through all of this, the family kept waking up to the sound of marching. The violence escalated until the morning the house caught fire. Lachlan McDougald, who grew up in the Baldoon settlement, remembered being on the river with 2 other men when they saw the flames tearing through the McDonald home. The family was still eating breakfast and had no idea that the house was burning. By the time help reached them, the house and the barn were already gone. The McDonalds barely escaped with their lives. John ran out with a coat, saying that the clothes on his back were all they managed to save. The community rallied around them, helping replace what they could. The family took up temporary shelter with John's brother-in-law, but the relief didn't last. The same disturbances followed them to the new house. Small fires broke out. Objects moved on their own. The family panicked, terrified that they were about to burn down the house of someone else's home. They packed up again and moved. For a while, they lived like wanderers. Every place they stayed, the activity found them again. Eventually, they gathered old sails from a neighbor and rigged up a tent to live in. It wasn't ideal, but at least it wasn't someone else's house at risk of being burned down. When winter hit, though, the tent wasn't an option anymore. They had no choice but to move back to their damaged log cabin. Once they were back inside, John McDonald threw himself into finding a solution. He went to the Protestant missionaries, indigenous medicine men, Catholic priests, anyone who might know how to stop whatever was tormenting them, but nothing worked. The activity kept coming, and the family was trapped in the middle of it. After years of exhaustion from the chaos, they finally decided that they needed help from someone who understood things beyond the physical world. And according to most accounts, this is when they turned to a woman who was said to have the gift of sight. So McDonald traveled with the minister McDormand all the way to Long Point to meet with a man named Dr. John F. Troyner. Troyner's daughter, Dinah, was known for her psychic abilities, and the family hoped that she might be able to explain what the heck was happening. Dinah listened to John's story and then went into her room, consulted her moonstone, and hours later she came back looking drained and told him exactly what she had seen. An old woman living in a long, low house who wanted the McDonalds off of the land. John was startled. He knew exactly who she meant. Years earlier, he argued with a woman and her sons who wanted his property. Diane went further, saying that the woman was a witch who could transform herself into birds. She asked John if he had noticed any strange burns on the farm. And he had. A black-headed goose had been hanging around his flock, and no one knew where it had come from. Diana told him this was the woman, and she said that there was only one way to stop her. He needed to shoot the goose with a silver bullet. If he hit it, the goose would disappear, and the woman would be wounded in the exact same place he struck the goose with the bullet. When John got home, he didn't waste any time. He melted down a piece of silver, cast a bullet, and loaded his gun. He walked the property until he spotted the black-headed goose. He fired, hitting it in the wing, and just like Dinah said, the goose vanished into the reeds. The next day, John walked past the house of the woman he'd argued with years earlier. She was there, sitting outside, with her arm in a sling. And from that moment on, everything stopped. The stones, the fires, the marching, all of it. All the chaos that had followed the family for years just ended. What exactly brought such an abrupt end to the strange incidents is one of the most intriguing parts of the Baldoon Mystery. Whether the story about the curse is true or not, the activity at the McDonald farm did stop. By the mid-1830s, talk about the haunting had faded, and the property was no longer a magnet for curious travelers hoping to witness something supernatural. After 3 relentless years of fear, chaos, and sleepless nights, the family finally had the chance to enjoy their land in peace. People still stopped by from time to time hoping for a glimpse of the phenomenon, but there was nothing left to see. In a strange twist of fate, the infamous farmhouse, the one that had survived storms, fires, and years of unexplained torment, eventually burned to the ground that same year, 1830. What really sets the Baldoon Mystery apart isn't just the bonkers list of events. It's the sheer number of people who swore they saw it happen. We're talking farmers, hunters, visitors, neighbors. About 26 eyewitnesses in total. Everyone from W.L. Burnham to an indigenous hunter named Solomon Partarsung to longtime resident L.A. McDonald all had something to say. And the thing is, John T. McDonald wasn't some fringe character. He was respected. People trusted him. When that many voices line up, it gets a lot harder to shrug the whole thing off as a campfire gossip. And the fascination never really died. Even now, the Baldoon Mystery pulls in historians, paranormal buffs, and anyone who loves a good "wait, what?" moment. Newspapers still run features on it. Ghost hunters still show up with cameras and EMF readers. The story has carved out its own little corner of Canadian folklore. Part of the reason the legend stuck was because of how it was recorded. Newspapers in the 1830s covered the events, but they kept things vague on purpose. They wanted people to come and see the chaos for themselves. The real backbone of the story comes from Neil McDonald, John's son, who was only 5 during the hauntings. As an adult, he tracked down 26 locals who remembered the events and published their accounts in the Wallaceburg News. These stories were later collected into a booklet, and that version became the blueprint for how the retellings have followed. But as the decades rolled on, especially during the late 1800s and early 1900s, when spiritualism was having its moment, the story grew legs. Writers added flair. Storytellers added drama. A few details got, let's say, creative. So now, trying to separate fact from folklore is like trying to untangle Christmas lights that have been in a box since 1972. Still, even if you strip away the embellishments, something genuinely strange happened in Baldoon. There are too many witnesses, too many documented incidences, and too many skeptics who tried, and failed, to debunk it. By the early 20th century, the location of the Baldoon House had become a full-on tourist attraction. Detroit-based cruise ships would pass through Wallaceburg, and deckhands would point out the haunted house to passengers who were more than ready to be spooked. The legend became a part of the region's identity, a ghost story with staying power. But there's a deeper layer here that modern scholars point out. Neil T. McDonald's version of the story reads like a classic settler narrative. Brave pioneers battling the evil forces of an unfamiliar land. It mirrors the real struggles of the actual Baldoon settlement, which collapsed more than a decade before the haunting. Failed crops, dying livestock, burned homes. These weren't just supernatural plot points. They were lived hardships of frontier life. There are 2 major theories of what sparked the Baldoon haunting, and both of them point straight back to the same thing. The McDonalds were living on a land with a long, complicated indigenous history. Historian Alan Mann notes that John McDonald had a clash with the neighboring Scottish family over a parcel of land, and that land supposedly happened to sit on an indigenous burial ground that was disturbed when the settlers were clearing it for farming. So right from the start, the soil under the McDonald house wasn't just dirt. It was layered with tension, history, and a whole lot of unresolved conflict. That type of tension shows up all over the Baldoon stories. Some of the earlier accounts include derogatory references to indigenous people, like Ray Ne Siwa, claiming that wild Indians were responsible for the disturbances. None of the witnesses ever named anyone specifically, but Neil Till McDonald described the group in a way that clearly reflected the settlers' prejudice of the time. Quote, "Not nice people," he wrote, "sullen, resentful, and making few friends." It's a snapshot of the social climate the story was born in. But I mean, honestly, who would want to make friends with a bunch of people who came into your backyard and started digging up your deceased loved ones? Can't really blame them. The truth is, the friction between the settlers and the Anishinaabe had been simmering long before the hauntings ever started. The McDonalds were part of a wave of settlers who pushed north of the original Baldoon settlement onto the land known as the Sheenale Carté. Some families, like the Stewarts, were even accused of tricking the Anishinaabe into giving up land. Chiefs in the region complained that the Baldoon settlement was built without permission and was blocking Indigenous farmers from planting their crops. So the idea that the land itself was unsettled, spiritually, politically, and culturally, isn't a stretch. Two Indigenous accounts add even more depth to the story. The earliest came from Chief Pa-Shi-Ji Shigwashkam, who told Reverend Peter Jones in the early 1830s that the McDonalds had unknowingly built their home on the former dwelling place of the Mama Simug, small supernatural beings sometimes described as fae. According to him, the Mama Simug had tolerated the settlers until the McDonalds cleared and burned the poplar grove where they had relocated. The destruction, he said, pushed them past their limit, and the disturbances were their retaliation. Another account, shared decades later by Chief Peter Wikasichik, claimed the haunting began after the settlers destroyed a medicine lodge on the land. In both versions, the message is the same. Something sacred was disturbed, and the land pushed back. And then there's John McDonald's own history. In the 1840s, his name shows up on a list of illegal squatters living on the Walpole Island First Nations. He wasn't supposed to be there, and the local Indian agent even singled him out as, quote, a very troublesome Scot. So while the haunting itself took place on the mainland in Sombre Township, the broader context, the land disputes, colonial tension, cultural friction, it adds a whole new dimension to the legend. In the end, the Baldoon Mystery sits in that perfect sweet spot between history and folklore. Something happened there, something that left enough of a mark that people are still talking about it nearly 200 years later. And whether you believe in curses, poltergeists, or just the power of a story that refuses to die, Baldoon has earned its place as one of Canada's most intriguing mysteries. This is Amanda Joy. Thank you for joining me down this crooked path. Keep your flashlights close and let the mysteries guide your way. Follow the path further. If this episode left you lingering in the shadows, there's more to explore. Follow Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates on upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking.